The Iranians are the master. We will not out-manipulate, out-maneuver the Iranians. So the more they feel Israel is weak, the more they see America splitting from Israel, the more they think they can get away with the retaliation.
In your eyes, does America truly understand the Middle East?
No, I don't believe they do.
I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. David Wurmser. He's the former senior Middle East advisor to former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, it's a pleasure.
I want to discuss, obviously, you've been here in Israel. You were here on October 7th. You happened to be here for a trip, a 5-day trip, and you ended up staying here for over a month. It seems unfathomable that we're nearly a year to the October 7th massacre, and over 100 hostages still remain in captivity in Gaza. I want to get your assessment on the ongoing negotiations, and specifically the role that the U.S. is playing.
I think the role the United States is playing, to some extent, has shaped this war. It isn't helping Israel. It's actually shaping the war for what it deems its own interests. I think that the fact that we're talking about this a year in is beginning to become an indictment to some extent of the way the United States has defined this war and its role in that war. It sees itself not clearly as Israel's ally, but much more as an above it all or neutral observer of the area that is trying to bring it to a certain degree of calm according to its ideas. When in fact, what really would be the natural role of the United States is first and foremost to be the ally of its principal ally in this conflict, and only then think more regionally and more theoretically about restoring stability to the region.
And so to speak, the prescription that the U.S. has about Israel is incorrect.
Correct. It's from day one been trying to restrain Israel, when from day one, the war needed more decision and needed to be more decisive. It needed to be, frankly, more aggressive. It was fine for the first month, but the United States already then was pushing Israel to pull back. From what we hear, it wasn't even clear whether the United States supported at the beginning the ground operation. They felt that a lot of this could be achieved without any ground operation. And what you're also seeing, I think, in a larger sense, is something else with the United States, which is Israel is talking about daily, every day. You can't turn on the news in Israel without hearing about conceptia, or the concepts that failed. And it's really shorthand, not of one idea that failed in Israel, but Israelis are in a state of shock, and in a state of shock, everything is being re-examined. And some things more, some things less, but you see a process in Israel of rethinking through everything, not of October 6th, but maybe of 20, 30, 40, 50, maybe even 60 years back. Defense concepts, governance concepts, legal concepts, strategic concepts, everything is slowly being opened up in a new book. And the Israelis will take the next few years in an agonizing structure of examination. The United States, on the other hand, this war actually is a reflection of Western problems with thinking about strategy, war, diplomacy, and yet the United States, rather than re-examining assumptions, is retreating more deeply and more stubbornly into paradigms that governed it before. And so what you see is essentially Israel and the United States before October 7th were quite aligned overall in the basic ideas. There might have been very serious disagreements over some of the applications of those principles, but they were aligned. But what you see since October 7th is Israel going through this big process, the United States retreating even deeper into the existing paradigm, and that's beginning to cause a fissure, a division. But again, in the United States, you're beginning to see a lot of voices emerge saying we need to listen to the Israelis, not only for Israel, but because Israel's a microcosm potentially of what America may face, is the United States itself. So you see the very, very first signs in the United States against the Biden administration, But the very first signs of saying, wait a second, maybe there's something wrong with the way we look at war, the way we look at strategy, the way we look at victory versus management, and things like that.
And to that point, when we're seeing the U.S. putting pressure on Israel versus Hamas who started this war, this instigated this war with the October 7th massacre, a war that Israel did not want, absolutely did not want. I think that also goes to show the misunderstanding of the Biden administration of really the situation here on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. The Biden administration has a default position. Again, it's emerging from their existing paradigms, which is that there are two fundamental ideas that anchor their concept of American interests, which ultimately both lead to, in their view, a sense of stability. The first is that you will not get any solution. There is no way Israel can maintain control over however many million Palestinians that today we hear they have, and that therefore Israel has to work out a solution. The solution can only come through the Palestinian Authority and a two-state solution. So everything devolves into the idea of what can you do to give the moderates among the Palestinians, supposedly the moderates, I'm saying their view, and I'm not necessarily agreeing with this, supposedly give the moderates in the Palestinian administration to validate them and strengthen them so that they can define the Palestinian Authority in a reasonable and effective way and allow for a resolution. The second pillar is that Iran is a regional power. Iran is strong. The Iranian regime is not going to fall. And as a result, the battle there is like with the Palestinians, is moderates versus hardliners, and that you would need to take policies that validate that validate the moderates and discredit the hardliners. And then you can work with the moderates in the Iranian regime to create a regional sense of stability and calm. And through that, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran will rein in its proxies and will stabilize the region. So the whole key for the United States is diplomatic resolution of the Palestinian issue through a two-state solution and a strategic condominium with Iran as the basic regional power, which obviously is completely at odds with the way the Israelis now see it. They saw the danger of autonomy to the Palestinians on such a level that they could essentially become a state with an army that invades Israel. And the inability that Iran is not a force for stability, it is inherently a force for instability. And that therefore there is no solution regionally as long as the Iranian regime exists and as long as the Iranian regime is allowed to enrich its assets and expand its power.
That leads me to my next question. In your eyes, does America truly understand the Middle East?
No, I don't believe they do. I believe that first of all, I'm not sure they understand history either. The moderate hardline division, by the way, it comes from pre-World War II. It comes from a Nazi propagandist. When it's shocking, but if you go back to the 1930s, there was a Nazi propagandist who tried to portray Hitler and Goering as moderates and Heydrich and Himmler and Goebbels as hardliners, and that if you push back against the Nazi expansions into the Ruhrland and the remilitarization of their army and then Anschluss, that you will validate the hardliners and you will undercut the moderates, and that will then lead to war. So you need to basically restrain yourself from reacting to the Nazis. Well, this was picked up by the Soviets, and they did that also in their arms control negotiations. When they dealt with the United States, they employed this model that seemed to work even for the Nazis. Well, now Iran has picked this up as well. So I think the United States keeps falling again and again and again into that rubric, which is inappropriate. The second thing is, I don't think, because religion in the United States is not seen to be a valid foundation of politics, we discount that, and by and large, most of our elites are not religious. So as a result, we tend to discount the role of belief. So, okay, Hamas is Islamic Brotherhood, et cetera, but do they really believe? No, it's self-interest. It says so you fall into the deterrence framework. There must be incentive structure that you can do to bring them around and to make them behave. and so forth, and same with Iran, that yes, they're Islamic, yeah, they believe on some level, but it doesn't overpower what we would call their rational self-interest. And I think that right there paralyzes the West in understanding what they're dealing with. And the third thing is, the United States is a very straightforward culture. It isn't a culture of deep dissembling or various nuanced linguistic mechanisms of convincing and manipulating. Americans are a rather raw country where it's pretty much straightforward. Iran is probably the most sophisticated country anchored to manipulation in the world. Its national treasure of literature is Scheherazade. And the whole story of Scheherazade is not only 1001 Nights and telling a story to buy time. It's really about how Scheherazade used the stories to manipulate the king, who she was telling the stories to grab his soul and turn him against what he had wished to do, which is to execute her in the morning. So she did this over days to pull him out, take over his soul, hijack his soul, and she, the symbol of weakness facing execution, became the most powerful figure in Persia. That's Iran. They're not impressed with power. They're impressed with strategic use of power. And the United States is not capable of understanding that.
And when we're talking about strategic use of power in the Middle East, in your eyes, should the U.S. take a more offensive approach to Iran? When it comes to deterring, I would say it's proxy war, but unfortunately it's become a direct confrontation with Israel in the region, but also to prevent a nuclear Iran.
Yes, there's, first of all, nuclear Iran it should be the fundamental American interest to oppose it. And we can get into whether that really is what America's after. I'm not entirely sure, despite what they say, and Israel believing that's what America thinks, and the deep faith that at some point America's red line will be crossed and America and Israel will be aligned on the nuclear program. I'm not sure that's true. I think the United States... and again, I'm talking about the current administration. There are other voices in America, but the current administration's in power, so that's what we have to deal with. I think they believe that Iran is inevitably going to be a nuclear power. The question is the conditions that you put it in when it reaches that, and how it can be leveraged for other things. But that's a whole different story.
My next question is Iran essentially playing the United States and the West in terms of this? You know, on the one hand, we've got the way of thinking of the Obama era, which is, as you said, appeasement. Let's come to the table. Let's have this nuclear deal. And then you've got the Trumpism, which is the more isolationism. But of the two, are either of them the right solution when it comes to tackling Iran?
See, I think that the United States, it really has two choices. Either it becomes so well-versed in Iranian culture and Middle Eastern culture that it can play in the marketplace of, and it's essentially asking a tourist in the Middle East to outmaneuver the negotiators in the marketplace, in a Middle Eastern market, which in my view is an impossibility. You are never going to be as good as the store manager in haggling. They've done this. This is what they do. The Iranians are the master. We will not outmaneuver the Iranians. The United States has a choice. It can either operate out of deeply held American ways of doing things, or become such an expert, which I'm saying they can't become. So it's really, I think what the United States has to do is basically function on two principles. One is power does matter, and the Iranians know it. The whole strategy of manipulation is to paralyze your power so that you don't use it. So we have to be aware constantly that the essence of Iranian strategy is to manipulate us into negating our own power, because only we can stop our power. They cannot. They don't have enough power to. So that's their game. So we have to remember we are powerful and they're scared of it. The second thing is, to manipulate somebody, you need to have predictability. You have to play by rules. So the Iranians essentially have negotiated informally with us through years certain predictable sets of rules and engagements, which of course are shaped to their advantage. So when they hit us with something like a bomb in an American base in Iraq or something like that, they've already gamed out 2-3 steps ahead what our potential response will be, because we're predictable and we play within certain rules. So if the United States is A, powerful, and B, remembers that predictability is what the Iranians depend on, it should be a principle of American policy to be unpredictable. That every once in a while we have to act outside of the expected rules that Iran asks of us. And a good example was the killing of Soleimani. It emerged from essentially a failed or an American... The Iranians had shot down an American drone over the Gulf of the Persian Gulf. The United States was going to strike, and in the last minute, President Trump pulled back the strike. And it looked like great weakness on the part of the Americans. But the response to that was not to, in many ways, the Iranians were expecting us to strike. They had already worked it out. They were going to use our own use of power against us by showing that we're weak and that we're predictable and respond in a way that then we didn't respond in fear of escalation and so forth. But we didn't. Ultimately, the response to that was the killing of Soleimani, which the Iranians did not expect, and they were terrified. And if you look at Iranian behavior after Soleimani, for the remainder of the Trump administration, they were quiet because they were scared. If America's powerful and remembered it was powerful, and America's unpredictable and therefore not manipulatable into paralyzing its own power, that combination in American policy is deadly for the Iranians.
We'll turn back to the American elections in just a minute, but I want to ask you, since we're on the topic of assassinations and killings, Iran has yet to launch that promised retaliatory strike against Israel for the killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. In the meantime, it's been playing this sick game of psychological warfare, which is unfortunately very good at. Do you believe that Iran will eventually carry out that attack against Israel? And what will it look like? Can we expect something like what we saw back in April? And to that point, can we expect the same joint coalition of forces to defend Israel as we saw back then?
I think it depends on Israel. I think the Iranians were going to strike back fairly quickly, and they hid behind the ceasefire negotiations to say, well, we'll give the ceasefire talks a chance to be reasonable. And again, I think that was sort of a psychological game with the West to show that, well, you should be very afraid of us, but we're so reasonable and so above it all that we are willing to allow this because we're humane and we'd like to see a resolution of the hostage issue and so forth. All a nice cover not to strike at that time. And the reason why they chose not to strike at that time wasn't the massive deployment of American power. They have no respect for American power at this point because it's not used. They did have a lot of fear of Israel because very shortly after the killing of Haniyeh, the Iranians said they're going to strike. Israel indicated that its strike package could be regime threatening. Not only did Israel say we could threaten the regime of Iran, but they started talking about hitting its oil structures, its ports. In other words, the economic lifeline of Iran, the entire economic vitality of the country. And if you hit the oil, the Iranian people feel it, but moreover, the Iranian government, to compensate for that, has to raise taxes. The Iranians don't have money anymore. It can bankrupt the country. They can't resupply Hezbollah. Iranians knew what that meant. And they knew that it could threaten the regime, and B, disarm them from being able to help their proxies all over the place. So the Iranians, I think, were responding to the Israeli threat and the knowledge that Israel is now playing out of the rules. Haniyeh showed Israel was willing to play out of the rules, and that Israel was powerful enough to do it. So power, unpredictability, terrified the Iranians, and they pulled back.
I want to turn back to the ceasefire negotiations, because we've seen reports in the recent days that the U.S. will perhaps attempt to negotiate directly with Hamas. What does that mean to negotiate directly with that terror organization? And in the sense, are we seeing the U.S. just strictly worried about its own interests here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a threat to Israel. They basically were doing it to say, well, if you don't want your hostages, we'll tell you, we're going to we're going to expose you as not being interested in getting your own hostages back by going and negotiating directly with Hamas. I think this was actually an anti-Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu move on the American part to emphasize, echo what was being said in the protests, that the Prime Minister doesn't care about the hostages. There is no real option to negotiate directly by the United States. It doesn't even have anything to give Hamas. But that said, there's something extremely dangerous in what America proposed. I already all along thought the hostage negotiations were crafted dangerously because you had two sides who operated as equals, Israel and Hamas. Hamas being treated almost as the same level of statehood as Israel, and a sort of a balanced in between. Now,
also the language that we're hearing from the Biden administration, calling on both leaders from both sides to come
constantly as if Israel and Hamas are the same, both morally and in terms of legitimacy, one being a state, the other being a state, when that's not the case. So I think that's a tremendous strategic victory for Sinwar, something that he can take to the bank and show that even the PA, the Palestinian Authority, didn't quite manage that. Now, if the United States negotiates directly with Sinwar, with Hamas, it goes one level higher. Israel's just another regional power. But they've raised the Palestinians, the Hamas leadership, to the equal to the United States, the global superpower. The diplomatic malpractice that represents is really astonishing and does reflect that the United States really does not understand the impact of what it's saying and doing.
And certainly doesn't understand the level of brutality of the terror organization that it's facing. We witnessed the brutality with the execution of 6 Israeli hostages, including 1 American, Bersh Goldberg, Poland. And 2 days later, Washington decided to announce criminal charges against Sinwar, Hamas's leader, and 5 other leaders in the terror groups in their connection with the October 7th massacre. But I want to ask you, why did the U.S. wait 11 months, almost a year since October 7th, to carry out this legal action?
That's a good question. It's at the end of the day, I think that's the bottom line, which is the United States saw this as something that needs to be solved not through war, but through diplomacy. If you indict the leadership of Hamas, then you essentially remove any incentive that they have to come to a diplomatic this is the way the Americans would think, that you got to give them an open door. You can't close the door on them because then they have no incentive to come to a diplomatic resolution. So therefore, don't put down the indictments because Sinwar then will walk. He won't continue with the talks. This tells you the United States, not since January or February, was discussing what is de facto the survival of Hamas in Gaza, but from the beginning. They said that they support Israel's removal of Hamas, but the fact that they didn't indict the leadership of Hamas tells me they always held that option open from day one, that Hamas would survive and that they need to be negotiated with. It goes to the deeper American, I think, the way war has begun to be understood in the West in the last 20, 30 years, which is quite different than the way war used to be understood in the West. America doesn't believe in victory. So they didn't believe Israel can defeat Hamas. Yes, they can militarily run it over and so forth, but Israel cannot win. That was the fundamental American view. And if Israel can't win, at the end of the day, there has to be a diplomatic agreement to end it. And you can't indict one side of that diplomatic agreement and get a diplomatic agreement. So I think at the end, that was the real reason why the United States didn't indict or early on Hamas.
Well, we're talking about Israel wanting to dismantle Hamas. That's been one of the main goals, including bringing home the hostages of the war. Can Hamas truly be dismantled? And I'm not talking about militarily. I'm talking about ideologically. When we're seeing that in the West Bank, there's continued support, in fact, increased support since October 7th for the terror organization.
It can be, but it needs an Israeli victory. And by Israeli victory, like you pointed out, it's not only a successful disarmament and physical removal of Hamas from office in Gaza, there has to be something that in their terms, according to their value system, represents such a catastrophic defeat that that their ideology crumbles and is proven to be ineffective. And I struggle to find what it is. I do not believe that it's based on human life. Namely, I don't believe Sinwar or others care one bit about Palestinian lives. So no matter what destruction you do to Palestinian society, I think for Sinwar and for Hamas, it's meaningless. It's just more martyrs, it's more propaganda, it's more international pressure on Israel. There's almost an alignment between the greater brutality, potential greater brutality, and Hamas's strategic objectives. On the other hand, you see one thing they're very sensitive about is land. Land and access to the outside world. So any hint that Israel may keep and hold on to territory, and any hint that Israel will sever the population of Gaza from the rest of the world, that becomes something terrifying for Hamas. And if that is the result of the war, that could lead potentially to a catastrophic defeat that leads to a discrediting of the idea. Ideas can be discredited.
I want to zoom out with you for a second and take a look at the wider Middle East and how much it's changed since the October 7th massacre.
Well, on the eve of October 8th, namely the day the attack took place, and it's already happened, Israel faced a devastating blow to its image of power. The peace process with the UAE that led to the Abraham Accords, the potential for peace with Saudi Arabia, all relied on Israel being a strategic asset to them in their overall survival in the region. Both had essentially begun to become very worried about the United States, already under the Obama administration, being drifting and losing its way. And they were looking for, they're not powerful enough to face their own enemies in the region. So they were looking for an ally, an asset, a strong horse that they could tie their cart to. And there was Israel acting independently and strong. So it became a natural for them to begin to form an alliance with the Israelis. And that was really what undergirded the movement toward the Abraham Accords and the movement toward Saudi Arabia. One of the reasons Iran struck Israel the way it did is to puncture that image of strength, to explode the balloon. And Israel, indeed, on October 7th, was limping. It looked like a lame donkey, not a strong horse. And everybody in the region, therefore, pulls back. So at that moment, any movement toward peace, indeed existing peace treaties, were on the table. Jordan's peace treaty, the UAE peace treaty with Israel, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, all were in grave danger because the image of Israeli strength had been burst. So over the last 8 to 12 months, Israel has begun to rebuild its image of strength. It could have done maybe more if it weren't restrained by the United States, but it has begun to improve its image of strength. And moreover, going into Rafah and going into the Philadelphia corridor against the wishes of the United States showed that Israel is powerful enough and confident enough and independent enough and indigenous enough to the region that it's a strong horse who won't go away because the American power is fickle, can go away. Suddenly the Americans can go home. Israel won't. And so the confidence and the strength is beginning to return to Israel, and it's beginning to create a dynamic of its own. Unfortunately, so I think Israel's position in the region is actually improving. The United States, on the other hand, is showing further and further weakness. That doesn't affect Saudi Arabia, the UAE. As long as Israel's perceived to be rising in strength, they will make peace with Israel. But Egypt's peace with Israel was based on being part of the Western alliance. Sadat made peace because he understood in the Cold War that America is more likely to win than Russia. And he wanted to be part of the American camp, and he understood the price of that he had to pay was peace with Israel. So Egypt did not make peace with Israel under the idea of the strong horse. They made peace with Israel as a down payment on their relationship with the United States. What is quite frightening right now is as the United States looks weak in the region, and the United States seems no longer to be a dependable ally for Egypt, Egypt is turning more and more to Russia, China, to pursue its interests, even by weapon sales are often a sign in the region of which way a country looks strategically, which orientation it wants to have. So this sale that's rumored to happen of F-16s not being sold, American F-16s not being sold to Egypt, and Egypt instead will go with Chinese weapons, is a dangerous signal that Egypt is changing sides. And if it changes sides for the same reason that siding with America led to peace, siding against America could lead Egypt out of peace. And that's a grave concern here with Israel.
Dr. David Wurmser, it was a pleasure having you here in studio today. I wish we could go on for more hours with this fascinating discussion, but thank you very much.
Sure.
And it surely is going to be a very interesting next few weeks, months, years here in the region, seeing how the tectonic plates of geopolitics change the region.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.